So a logical follow-on from this is one thing we saw when we created simple models is there was a fair amount of support provided for the routes that would map to the CRUD actions on those models. Right? So we saw that the URI helpers like movies path or edit movie path, and you pass an argument, which is the primary key of a movie. These were sort of built-in helpers so that when a route was decoded, the params necessary to do something useful, right, to make it a resourceful, restful route where it's self-contained, would automatically sort of be part of it. So if the route was for showing the information about a particular movie, we would try to create a route that had the primary key params ID embedded somewhere in the URI, and that made it self-describing. Or if you were updating information about a movie, the update URL would again include a param which was the ID of the movie being updated, so that makes it restful, right? It's self-contained, it's a description of a name of the resource we want to operate on and the operation that we want to do. So the question we address here is how are we doing this when we have an association, especially a through association, because now remember that if I'm creating something like a review, it actually has to be owned by two different things, right? Besides the review information itself, or the ID of that review, I also care about the foreign keys of the movie ID and movie goer ID that it could be associated with. So the question here is how do the URI helpers and other methods extend to help you do that? Because you need this info at creation time, right? And all of the helpers that we've seen so far only carry around a single piece of information, which is the primary key ID of the specific model that you're updating, because we haven't talked about associations yet. So to do this, Rails provides a way to extend these helpers to do nested RESTful routes. And before, what we had in our routes.rb was just resources movies. Remember that this sort of gives us that collection of basic CRUD routes. Well, we could also pass a do block to resources movies, and it turns out that inside that do block we can nest another resource, right? So what this means is movies are a thing, and we want the CRUD actions on that thing, but movies also are the parent. That's why movies are on the outside of this relationship. Movies are the parent of this other thing, reviews. Reviews are themselves RESTful. They have a primary key. I want the URI helpers and all that stuff. But what the nesting is telling me is that I also want a nested route that will allow me to unambiguously access a review based on what movie it belongs to. So how does that work? Well, the way that these routes look is, for example, before, when we would have had edit movie path with a single argument, now we have an edit movie review path, right? So this says, by convention over configuration, the first model name is the owning model, and the second one is the owned model. So I have a movie, and movies own reviews. They have one or they have many reviews. And now the movie review path helper takes two arguments. One of them is the ID of the movie, and the other one is the ID of the review. Why would you want the RESTful URI to look like that? Because in some sense, to uniquely specify, in the presence of just the relationship movie has many reviews, to uniquely identify a review RESTfully, it's not enough to have the information in the review. You also have to have the foreign key telling you what movie it's supposed to point back to, right? So what ends up happening is that the same route helpers that you've already seen are now extended. They can take an additional argument so that you can capture the ID of both the owning side and the owned side of the association. And as an example in this route, the wildcards become available as movie ID and params and ID, right? So again, ID is always the primary key of the primary resource. So in this case, these routes are about reviews. That means that ID is the ID of a review, but movie ID is a foreign key within that review of the movie that it's going to point to, right? It's basically, this is how we're mapping all these pieces back to the example that we did. Now, again, as with the RESTful URI helpers that you already saw, you don't have to generate your routes this way. The benefit of doing it this way is that if you change the scheme by which URI names are mapped to RESTful resources, then the URI helpers are automatically updated for you. So you don't run the risk of deciding, for example, that you want to change where in the URI the different IDs are located, and then you've got different places in your code where URIs with the wrong format are essentially hardwired, and you have to change them all around. So what does this look like when you actually use it? Well, here's an example using the create method, which, good, I'm making sure that you can see my mouse there. So now, if we're creating a new review, remember we got to do two things, right? Just as we did before, we have to get the information for the review itself, and we assume that we constructed the form such that params reviews will give that back to us. But we also need the foreign key of what the review is going to point to. So because we're using the nested route helper, because we set it up so that the URI includes both the movie ID and the review ID, we can actually just go ahead and grab params movie ID and use that to fill in what the movie is so that we can use this build method. Right? So now you start to see how these pieces fit together. We retrieve the foreign key of the owning object, and we use the build method on reviews of that owning object so that we can start creating a review that has the correct foreign key value already filled in for us. And again, when we try to save the review, if all goes well, where can we redirect? Well, one possibility is we could redirect to the page of all reviews for this movie. And analogously to movies path for all the movies ever, movie reviews path for a given movie is all the reviews for this movie. Right? So again, we're looking at nesting in the RESTful and the config routes.rb file. The nesting indicates who is the owner and who is the owned, so to speak. And it defines URI helpers going sort of from the outside in, where you get the ID of the owning object and the ID of the owned object, which you can then pull out in your controller method so that you can create valid instances of the owned object. So that means that what would it mean to try to put up the blank form for creating a new review? Well, thinking ahead, right? If we have a form that the user is going to fill in to create a new review, at the moment that form gets submitted, we have to be able to tie that review to a movie ID. So that means that the information about what movie ID it's connected to essentially has to be served at the same time the form is served. We need for the form to contain that information so that the URI generated when we post it back will have all the correct IDs embedded in it. So one way to do that, and sort of the canonical way to do it in Rails, is in the new method, before we serve the form, we identify which movie we wanted to create the review on. And why are we using the or equals idiom here? When we could have also just written it out longhand this way. Why did we use the syntactic sugar? Well, because if there was already a review existing for this movie that we were trying to edit, or if there was an unsuccessful save, if you remember when we did the simple models, one of the things we did in the new action is preparing for the fact that we might get redirected to it over and over again if the user didn't fill in valid information. We used double or equals or double pipe equals, so that if there was already a value for this instance variable, we wouldn't override it. So we're just using the same trick here. There's nothing specific about associations to the fact that we're reusing the same trick. But the main thing is that we've captured both the value of movie and the value of review so that they can be incorporated into that form. Right? In the form, we're going to use both movie and review as arguments to update movie review path so that when the form gets posted, we'll be able to pull those things out of params. So you can sort of see a pattern emerging here. Right? Whenever you're going to do something that involves creating or modifying a resource, at the moment you submit the form that does that, that form has to come with all of the information you need to create or update that resource in place. That means that when you serve the form, you have to have found a way to get that information into it when you first serve it. There's another possibility. If you find that, in our case, we've said, well, look, if a review belongs to a movie, it's always going to be the case, whenever we do pretty much any CRUD action on a review, that it would be useful to figure out what movie it belongs to. In fact, we might have put in a validation that says you can't create a review unless it is owned by a valid movie. So if that's true, if we've assigned, if we've sort of established that invariant, and we know that all of our reviews are always going to have a valid movie ID foreign key, then we could just put it in a before filter. And this is a fairly common thing to do as well. So here's a before filter that could go in the reviews controller that runs before every action in the reviews controller. Right? And we're claiming that that's justified by the fact that we have set it up so that you can never save a review without having a valid movie ID field. So if that's really true, we should be able to always look it up. Right? Whenever any action runs that involves modifying a review, then whatever, if we use the RESTful URI helpers to create the forms, we should always have a params movie ID somewhere in the form or somewhere in the URI. And we should always be able to do movie.find. Actually, I should have done find by ID so it doesn't throw an exception if it's not found. In fact, I'm going to do that change just for the record. Hold on, find by ID. That's there. OK, there it is. So another possibility is we should always be able to retrieve that movie, right? Theoretically, if our database is really valid, we should be able to find a movie whose params movie ID matches its primary key. Or if we don't find it, in other words, if this evaluates to nil and we're forced to follow the other side of the double pipe, we could just do a redirect and say something got screwed up. You passed me a URI. What could have happened here? Well, either a URI was passed that was malformed, Maybe there's a bug in the URI helper method that you wrote yourself. Maybe some clever user tried to sort of manually construct a URI, hoping to force you to pull out params that the user controlled. Or another possibility is that the database is corrupted, right? Somewhere along the line, you actually ended up being able to write a review record that didn't contain a valid movie ID, and now you're hosed because you got to figure out why. But basically, under normal circumstances, we assume that we could put this in a before filter, it runs before any action, and if the unthinkable happens, we can always detect that fact and redirect, right? And again, the motivation for a redirect here is if we really have a review whose movie ID is invalid, there's really no point in going any further because anything we try to do with that review is probably going to run into errors, right? Anytime we try to modify it, if we can't figure out what movie it's associated with, we've already sort of lost the game. So a very common thing to do when you're dealing with controllers that work with resources that participate in an association is to put the logic into a before filter that looks up what the owning relationship is. And that way, that information is just available as an instance variable to any of the controller actions, and you don't have to do it separately for each one. So what does this look like in the views? Well, here's an example of what the view might look like for editing an existing movie. So I still can use form tag. I can use the URI helper movie review path, but of course I've got to give it two arguments. One argument is the movie that owns this review. The other argument is the review itself. And that's why when this form is submitted, and by the way, what's it going to create form fields of? Well, it's a movie review path. Not a movie review path, but a movie review path. Think about what's the least surprising version of this? Movie is an adjective. It's a review path, but it's a review path for a particular movie. So this is creating a review, but it's going to carry with it information about which movie it belongs to, and that's how we know how to fill in the foreign key. We can look up param's movie ID and get the right value for it. And again, a reasonable thing that we could redirect to or use as another landing page is all reviews for a given movie. That's just movie reviews path. And again, the plural forms of these, they exactly follow the simple ones we did when we were doing just a single model at a time. And we have to pass the movie for which we want to run the query, all reviews for this movie. So again, keep in mind that all of these methods, the URI helpers, has many, belongs to, those are all conveniences that allow us to maintain essentially the fiction that what we're really manipulating is a set of Ruby objects that are related to each other. What's really happening underneath, as we know, is that these are things that are in a database. That means that every time we create an object, if we stipulate that an owned object always has a valid owner, that means that the invariant is really the presence of these keys. Right? It's the foreign key fields are in those tables. They're filled in with a value, and the value actually points to a primary key that's the real primary key of some other model that's the owning model. So that's really what matters, right? In terms of the underlying representation of our models, that's the invariant. Everything else, all of these methods are just a way to make the code easier to write, easier to read, easier to maintain, but there's no magic, right? You could do all of this yourself using plain old queries and filling in every object attribute the hard way. So with that in mind, suppose we also have the relationship that a moviegoer has many reviews. Could we expect to use moviegoer review path as a URI helper, like I've been doing with these other examples? So we might say, yep, because of convention over configuration, that should just work. No further action required on your part. We could say, yes, but we'd have to declare reviews as a nested resource of moviegoers. And didn't we already declare reviews as a nested resource of movies? And is that all right? We could say no, because we already declared reviews as a nested resource of a movie. That gave us a particular set of routes to get to a review by going through the movie, and there can only be one restful route to get to any particular resource. So we already sort of used it up. Or we could say no, because if we're going to have more than one through association involving reviews, then it'll be ambiguous. There'll be no way to figure out what the correct query is to create the new review, and therefore there's no way you could create this URI helper. So which of these four is the case?